This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Risk Revolution, a monthly series of the Voices in Validation podcast brought to you by the IVT Network. Having just celebrated a first-year anniversary of the launch of this series, we continue to work to advance the maturity of risk management practices through topics that challenge quality professionals to seek opportunities to improve and progress the ways in which they perceive and manage risk. This week, it's an all-Irish crew as our series coordinator, Nuala, is joined once again by Risk Revolution regular co-host, Valerie Mulholland, to get up close and personal with the new ICH-Q9 revision, asking if it goes far enough. And we are delighted to introduce our guest this week, Kate Coleman from PharmaLex. So welcome to all three of you. Thanks for being with us for such an important topic.
Thank you, Stacey. It's great to be back on Risk Revolution in a new year and with a new guest, Kate Coleman, to get under the hood of the new ICH Q9 revision that arrived as an early Christmas present late last year. So Kate, not only have you worked in a variety of quality roles across the pharma industry for almost 20 years now, covering biologics, sterile fill finish, vaccines, and oral solid dosage, of course, but you're also a practicing QP, which is a particular attribute here on this side of the pond in Europe, and a qualified lead auditor at PharmaLex, which really places you at the sharp end of risk management and the risk-based decisions every day in the work that you do. So a big welcome to you, Kate, and a warm welcome back to Val. Thanks for co-hosting again. You gave us a whistle stop. Yeah, Val, you gave us a whistle stop tour of Q9 or 1 revision in December. But now that you've had some time to digest the details, no doubt you'll have lots more to share with us.
Yes, Nuala. Hi, everybody, and welcome, Kate. Yeah, the last time we spoke, if you remember, we had less than 24 hours to have a look at ICH-Q9 Rev 1, the draft. And there was, of course, 4 focus areas that we mentioned in the last episode: more guidance around formality, a call to arms to control subjectivity, more clarity on risk-based decision-making, and of course, that connection with product supply as a risk. That also needed to be managed. So yeah, I've had a deeper read, and it's quite clear that woven through is that connection with knowledge management. And it strikes me that knowledge management started with that famous diagram in ICH-Q10. Remember the one with KM as that co-enabler with QRM? And I know you remember, Nuala, because you did an awful lot of work in that area. And remember, they drew it as 2 unconnected parallel lines. And now we're all talking about the interconnectivity of those. And of course, that reminds us of our episode with Marty Lippa, who did so much work in connecting them up. But that interconnectivity is quite clear through ICH-Q9 or 1. So, it really is there. Anyway, the exciting aspect of today's podcast, as I think we're going to be hearing, because we have an end user here, a decision maker with keen focus on the patient. And I'm very keen to hear what Kate's view is on what's working or not working at the sharp end, as you call it, for the practitioner.
Yeah, welcome, Kate. Welcome to Risk Revolution.
Thanks a million, Stacey and Nuala, for having me, and for Val for having me as well. So this is an area, I suppose, I do an awful lot of work in this space, and as you said, I touch it from lots of different angles. So I see with our clients what works, what doesn't work. I use it myself to solve problems, and looking at collecting information and trying to put that into a risk assessment or a quality risk management strategy so that it doesn't get lost. So I really look forward to talking to you today about all of those things and all the different angles that this new revision brings up as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So let's dive right in. Kate, you wrote a blog on January 7th for the IVT Network, and you called out that while the basic principles of quality risk management haven't changed, and it still stands that the evaluation of risk should be based on scientific knowledge and linked to the protection of the patient. But you also mentioned that the level of effort and formality, as usual, should be commensurate with the level of risk. But one significant change in this emphasis that's evident in the opening section of the draft is mentioned in regard to managing the risk to availability. So this is one shift, and we've seen this where they've talked about, the protection of the patient by managing the risk to quality and availability, where availability risks arise from either quality or manufacturing issues should be considered of prime importance. So I know as a QP, this factor of supply security and availability is often at the heart of the risk-based decisions that you're called upon to make. So what are your thoughts on seeing this emphasis up front in the new revision?
Well, I suppose a lot of what's in the new revision, I don't see anything too new in this, and I'll explain why. So part of my background has been working with products that are, used to treat rare diseases. And, in my background, it wasn't, you couldn't just reject a batch. You always had to have a very good reason for rejection, because there was patients sitting in the clinic with very rare, possibly genetic or enzyme disorders, that if they didn't receive the product, it wasn't just a case of it being, a bit of a pain for them not getting it. Their conditions would actually irreversibly deteriorate because they didn't receive a dose. So that was always, coming from that environment, when we would look at risk management and quality risk management, it was any risk to the patient. So if that included the patient sitting in the clinic and being told, actually, we don't have enough vials for you today, and them having that worry of, well, am I going to deteriorate because of this? So, there's specific diseases out there, and particularly with the likes of ATMPs, and the rise of cell therapies and things like that are a lot more complex. We have more and more of this situation. So for those of us who maybe have more expertise in the standard pharmaceuticals, where maybe there's multiple different players producing the same types of drugs, that's a very different thing to the space where, the rare diseases ATMPs are coming from. So that always would have been a risk. And it was always part of the risk to the patient, or something that could cause harm to the patient. So I don't see it as something new. I think companies should always have been looking at what are all of the angles that could impact patient. Now, there is one caveat with this part, being included in ICHQ9 that I think should be highlighted, and that's, that this, look at product availability is only applicable if you have a product that a patient must have, and must have your brand. And it shouldn't be seen as a potential loophole for companies to start bringing in business risk because they're not getting their product on the market. So it's not about a company just getting their product out there and then prioritizing business risks in order to make that happen. This doesn't apply to some companies. This won't apply in the generics business, because you're competing with other producers to make sure that your product is the one front and center that you're getting a pharmacist to prescribe. This is really only applicable where you are the only manufacturer of that product, and if your patient doesn't get that product, there is going to be harm to them. So now we're back to this piece of, it's about harm to the patient that we're trying to avoid. We're not trying to give loopholes for business objectives to now start to be included in quality risk management.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very interesting. What are your thoughts on that, Val? Can shift in emphasis, help break down some of the silos that we see? Certainly I would see and come up against it routinely, where you might find somebody in the quality unit making a quality call around patient safety, and they're finding that they're at loggerheads with some of their colleagues in supply chain or operations, like Kate refers. What are your thoughts on this, Val?
Yeah, there always seems to be a lorry that has to leave on a Friday, doesn't there? I think that's the truth. But I think you hit the proverbial nail on the head there, Nuala, when you said, use the term supply chain, because, there are a number of actors linked to the core activity of moving materials or product, of the right quality through all the steps and stages to the patient. And There's one thing moving these physical materials along, but surely there's also a whole bunch of requirements that have to go with them: the specs, the information, the communication, the knowledge, and the management of risk, you know. And it does beg the question, you know, how shared or dynamic are the accompanying risk assessments, you know, if you were to trace the chain from, you know, we think of the product life cycle very much from development through to retirement. But if you look at a life cycle from material to expiry date, you know, that's a whole chain of communication and risk that has to be managed as well. And, you know, I don't know how well the risk assessments are dynamically shared with often suppliers and other partners in that chain also. And, you know, you use the word holistic there as well. You know, it's managing all those parts as separate entities that make the whole come together, you know. And, you know, Kate mentioned something there, you know, which is quite interesting about the, you know, the closeness of supply sometimes to the patient. But I think we're seeing a growing problem at the other end with materials. You know, there's you know, there are business shortages in a way with components and vials and stoppers in particular, but, you know, buffers and all sorts of reagents that are, you know, you know, seriously putting pressure on supply, and that is a risk benefit there that, you know, the trade-offs have to be made surely in places. So it's a very interesting and emerging dilemma, isn't it?
It is. And, you know, I know we've talked about this on the podcast before, where we've talked about the need for that kind of cross-functional, more holistic view of risk across the supply chain. And we even went as bold in our revolution to suggest that maybe we should be taking the Q out of QRM and looking at it as risk management. Because sometimes by putting that Q in there, first of all, everybody else opts out and they think, oh, the quality unit are responsible for you know, managing this quality risk assessment. But also it can end up with that silo-based thinking, and it, you know, for me, for sure, I would much prefer to see a much more holistic view of how we manage risk end to end, and that availability of that drug, because our patients don't care about how complex our supply chains are, or indeed the availability of stoppers. They only care about, you know, having the right dose at the right time at the right price in the market that they live in, with, you know, with access to that. So it is a little bit marriage with our OPEX brethren, and the work that I've done with the St. Gallen team around on time in full, a really valuable metric that can be used as a surrogate for the effectiveness of the PQS system. And that was proved through our research, that looking at, you know, organizations that score well on their on time in full, which means they're getting their product into the marketplace, to the place where it's supposed to be at full specification, at full quality, indicate that they have an effective PQS working, you know, across the supply chain. But anyway, another welcome addition to the opening section that I was pleased to see is the details that they provide on the need for a proactive approach. And they, quoting the guidance, the draft guidance now, a proactive approach to quality risk management facilitates continual improvement and is of strategic importance in achieving that effective pharmaceutical quality system. So I know we've talked about this many times on the podcast, and the potential damage done to the business and the patient from the, you know, ongoing practice that we see of reactive risk management, that the only time we employ risk management is really when, you know, the horse is bolted. Kate, what do you think the new revision of ICHQ9 will it force a change in how QRM is applied? You know, will it alter the application of QRM in the industry to be more proactive rather than reactive?
I'm not sure, because it's always been inherent in the ICHQ9 guidance to prioritize proactive risk management as opposed to reactive. But still what we see consistently across the organization is, or across the industry rather, is that people only really look at risk assessment to get them out of trouble. And I think part of the problem here, and it's a little bit like you talked about there about removing the queue. One of the issues with that is that we always have to be careful that we don't mix the scope of our risk assessments. This is where people get into an awful lot of bother in trying to understand how to manage it. So there's business risk, and things like not being able to make enough of your product is a business risk, whereas the quality risk, we really have to think about the patient. And then this leads into the proactive piece, because when we look at quality risk management, as it's written in ICHQ9, the focus is the patient, and the patient getting the best therapy that they can, and they get it, they get access to it. And as you said, they get access to it no matter where they are. In order to do that, you need to be able to see all those risks in advance. And this is where the proactive piece comes in, and it makes perfect sense. But I don't think we have enough information. What does that actually look like on the ground? And what is there to benefit a company really pushing the proactive piece? Because it's hard work. In order to have a proactive risk assessment, you need to go through your full process flow for any process that you're trying to risk assess. You need to take the time out when there might not be, a burning issue that's driving the resources for that. And sometimes people won't really understand, well, what's the benefit at the end of the day? And you mentioned a link to OPEX, and it's one of the things that I'm quite passionate about, is that risk assessment and operational excellence and lean, they're actually all interlinked. If you do a proactive risk assessment and you explain to the team that this will mean that you should have less deviations. If your proactive risk assessments are working properly for, let's say, a filling process, it should be telling you what could go wrong before it goes wrong with your equipment, with your process. Therefore, your number of deviations should reduce. And if they don't reduce, there's something else wrong in your pharmaceutical quality system. What a lot of people tell me is, oh, but we still have procedural non-compliance all over the place. And that's a whole different issue. But, we're not, again, taking the circuit breaker there and saying, well, if our highest trend is procedural non-compliance, have we done an assessment of where that's going wrong so that we can fix it? Take away the deviations out of the system, take away all of that noise. The other piece that's really critical, that I'm a little bit disappointed in terms of how this draft has spoken to this, is where do you use proactive risk assessments? So for example, it doesn't really specify that if you have a proactive process FMEA or a proactive contamination control risk assessment or a proactive system risk assessment as part of your CQV, you don't need to repeat your risk assessments over and over again. So you should have a base level of these proactive risk assessments. When I have a change that I need to make on a process, I don't need another change control. I should be going back to my process FMEA. I should be going back to my contamination control risk assessment. I should be finding the process step where I want to make my change. And based on the knowledge that's already in those proactive risk assessments, I should be just writing what my risk-based rationale is, revising those baseline proactive risk assessments and moving on, rather than always exponentially increasing the size of the quality risk management database that you have on a site. So I think there needs to be a lot more detail given on how does this actually work for people, what's the benefit and what will they save? And then they'll start to look at freeing up resources to do all this proactive work.
Yeah, you make a really, really good point there, and it's something I'm equally passionate about. Is that you mentioned you go back to your process flow, but again, this is almost an unusual event. Even here in this draft guide, where they say, before you start your risk assessment, here's the things you need. Go and get your data and your process flows. We very often walk into a room and they don't have a well-defined process flow. We're not using up-to-date process maps that enable us to look at stepwise through the system, to look at all of the inputs and outputs and engagements that are happening, whether that's human factors, and that's where a lot of that the procedural issues arise. But that is not a tool that is seen routinely. Usually where you'll see good process maps is where you have a strong OPEX program in-house. Exactly. And I totally agree. Risk management and continuous improvement or operational excellence are two sides of the one coin. And they for really every continuous improvement, there should be a commensurate reduction in risk that you're bringing in. So absolutely. Val, not enough enough teeth here to get folks to recognize where, you know, that the most effective way is to prevent rather than cure. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we do talk a lot about prevention, do we, and being proactive, and it is great to see a sentence in there promoting that. But the question you're asking, does it go far enough? You know, I think it's unfortunate, and you and I have mentioned this before, that the UpRev is focused on the same mechanistic analytical tools, you know, problem solving that comes from the engineering history within our organizations. And there's nothing wrong with that, but to manage complexity, which is mentioned in the update, you know, you need an overview of signals emerging from all over your PQS system, you know, that do so and give you time to respond, you know, before your goose is cooked, as you say, or before the product is impacted. And, you know, I did a quick calc there last night. You see, I do my homework, Nuala. And I had to look at the ISO standard 31010 2019, the one that gives you all the risk management techniques. You know, there are 43 techniques in that guide, you know, and the current ICH only has 10 of those, and they're particularly a particular set of tools that are designed to deep dive rather than that overarching purview, you know. And even of the 10 that are mentioned in ICH Q901, I would think I only see about a quarter of those in practice in my travels as well, you know, the ubiquitous FMEA, as you're always saying. And, you know, but at the same time, to pick up a point that I think Kate made, I'm not sure that's entirely the fault of the guidance. There's nothing to prevent us from using different toolkits and more proactive tools and taking a hard look at understanding and developing, you know, preventative feed forward controls. I mean, feed forward control is mentioned in ICH Q10, so there is a paradigm for it. So, you know, maybe we ourselves need to do more work in this area, and maybe, you know, the guidance, you know, maybe we can't expect the guidance to be the place where the push is. You know, there's nothing to stop us making those pushes ourselves, perhaps, you know. I don't know, just my thought.
One thing I'd say about it, just when you mentioned the ubiquitous FMEA there, I'm actually not down on FMEA at all, because I think it's been adopted by the industry as a safe place, because it's something that has guidance behind it. But what nobody has explained to the industry, or you know, what we are trying to do, you know, those of us on these sort of forums, is that FMEA had a different place in manufacturing. We're a high impact industry, so we have to adapt the tools for a high impact industry, which is not the case for your standard manufacturing. And FMEA is actually only designed for prospective risk assessment. It is not designed to be reactive. It was designed for military risk assessment, to, you know, establish what risks were going to happen and, you know, how to prevent them. So using it retrospectively in any sense is actually against the tenets of FMEA. So we've adopted something as an industry and we've kept using it without actually understanding it. And I think, you know, when we go into, and everybody's experiences, you go into a room to do an FMEA and it's a blank screen, and it's, when you start with a tool like that, it's the tail wagging the dog, because the prep hasn't been done. We haven't asked, what are we assessing? Why are we assessing it? What do we want out of it? We haven't gone through our definitions of what does each score mean. And I think we've been a little bit lazy as an industry in terms of not doing all that prep work. And it actually said in the old ICH Q9 that when you do all that prep, and it actually says it in there, it's very clear on it, but we've skipped over it over time, is it tells you that if you do that prep and if you have a good risk statement, that the tool will fall out of that. The tool will become evident. But we've just kind of gone with what we know, and we haven't actually applied that way of logical thinking. So I agree with you, Val, in that I think the guidance can only go so far, but I think there hasn't been the encouragement to read it in the right way across the industry. I think that's where I've been tied up in knots.
Yeah, and
point.
you know, just to close on that matter, you know, I appreciate the prospective and retrospective, but even just to come back to this word proactive, for me, I think that well, you mentioned the tail wagging the dog, but the tail of this mechanistic process that they have, which again, you know, we might get to talk about before the end of today's episode, the risk review step that is so, you know, absolutely orphaned in many of the risk management programs that we see. That is where we could be proactive in really doing rigorous and routine risk reviews, so that even if you've done your prospective FMEA and you've commissioned and qualified your piece of kit, your filling line, or whatever you're talking about, you know, that we make the assumption that that we must have gotten everything right, and it's only then when events arise that we say, oh, we missed something, or we have a change, or you know, we need to go in. But if, you know, almost under the CPV type programs, we were doing routine risk reviews, not as part of the annual product review, but as a routine step, perhaps part of the, as I say, the CPV program, there is a much better chance that we would be looking at some of these other tools, or looking at some of the metrics, and looking at the number of deviations or the number of human errors, and saying, well, what did we miss? Why are we, our risk controls are not being effective in the way that we presumed them to be before we commenced production. We're now 100 batches in, or 1,000 batches in. What do we know, coming back to this knowledge management, what do we now know about our overall process of the socio-technical infrastructure of the people, plus the equipment, plus the fabric of the building? What do we now know that we didn't know previously? And that would be much more proactive, rather than waiting for the deviation to lead to a CAPA, and then we've got 30 days to close the CAPA and the gun to our heads, and we're off. Yeah. But anyway, another area that gets much coverage in the guide is the issue of subjectivity. And they even go as far as to mention the impact of bias, which of course is a topic we've covered many times on this podcast previously. So Kate, is this something that has caused issues in the application of QRM, this concept of subjectivity? And do you have any guidance on avoiding subjectivity from your own practical experience?
So I've probably done hundreds of quality risk assessments over the last, particularly as a consultant over the last 4 years. It is into the hundreds at this stage. And that's not even including the ones that I was, you know, helping people with. Absolutely. And one of the biggest bugbears of mine is where a company has one, you know, guidance in their SOP for how you score severity, likelihood and occurrence, a likelihood of occurrence and detection. Or they give these very, very kind of vague definitions, like, you know, for likelihood of occurrence, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000. You know, and what does that really mean in our industry? It actually doesn't mean anything. If I'm doing a contamination control risk assessment, 1 in 100 is saying, if I have 1 in 100 as my low risk, I'm saying that if for every 100 batches, I'm happy to have one that's contaminated. And we don't ask ourselves, what do these scores really mean if we talk about them out loud like a story? So for every risk assessment you do, you need to establish, you know, a mechanism for reviewing those definitions, making them very, very clear, so that when you have a score of whatever it might be for severity, likelihood of occurrence and detection, that it's very clear what the score means and what the definition of that score is, and that there's no ambiguity about it. To give you one example that we see time and time again is in the likelihood of occurrence scoring. So we know that if you do an FMEA in our industry, severity a lot of the time will be high. It's the effect of the risk without controls. That's the definition of it. So you can't alter severity really. And it's going to high impact industry, it's generally going to be a high score. So where we manage likelihood of occurrence is by looking at our controls. So all of our design controls, how we've designed our process, our automation, our quality management system, and backed up by our qualification. How do all of these things come together to allow us to score likelihood of occurrence? So if I said to you, okay, I've got multiple design controls in how I've designed my process, I've designed my facility in a way that's optimal, I've got, procedures, batch records, I have qualified everything I can qualify, and all of these things go together to prevent this specific risk. That gives me an ability to say, well, with all of these together, the likelihood that this is going to occur with the current controls in place is low. Whereas if I have one procedure that is relying on a person then the likelihood of occurrence is much higher because we're relying on just one person to always make the right decision or to always understand. Oftentimes that definition of, high likelihood of occurrence is when you're relying on one person or you have no control, or low likelihood of occurrence is where you have multiple levels of control that have been validated, that have been shown to be robust and that we've data for. Having a definition like that means no one can argue with it. It's very, very clear, and it's very easy then to set the score and make it completely objective. The more vague it is, the easier it is to have those discussions in a risk assessment room with everybody there going, oh, sure, that wouldn't happen. The amount of times that I've heard people say, well, the severity is not high because sure, we've an isolator, that wouldn't happen. And you have to step back and say, you know what, your isolator is part of your design. It's part of the design control. So your severity is still high, but your likelihood of occurrence has reduced because you've got this extra design in place. So it's making your definitions detail those things that take away that subjectivity, make it objective, but make it objective to the specific risk assessment you're doing. So one size fits all and your scoring definitions won't always work.
Yeah, and it reduces that scoring by opinion that can often happen when you've got a group of SMEs, as I refer to it as the cult of the expert, where everybody has an opinion and they believe that on the basis of their opinion and their 20 years experience or 50 years experience, they're entitled to make a call on this, irrespective of what data they have to back that up or scientific evidence, or as you say, very, very clear and clarified scoring criteria. I totally agree. Scoring criteria should be almost customized on a case-by-case basis.
Absolutely.
Or certainly by a group of type of potential events. Val, one of the areas that this where subjectivity is mentioned in the new revision is in relation to your own specialist subject, decision making, risk-based decision making. And how it can impact that and the effectiveness of those decisions made from our QRM activities. And they also go on to mention this concept of decision nodes. So what do you think, Val? What are they getting at there?
Yeah, blessed are the decision makers, I've decided, because the Rev 1 is actually allocating to them as a key responsibility the control of subjectivity. I think that's a challenge, And in some ways, is it that hard either? I mean, there's a school of thought that says there should be perhaps a fourth question tagged on to risk assessments, the current three, or what could go wrong, how likely is it? What's the likelihood you detect it? And maybe we should just add on, are you sure? How sure are you, is the data supporting your risk assessment or your risk control decision? How reliable is it? And how reliable do you need it to be? So, I mean, would you be happy to move along with a kind of a 50-50 here, or does it need to be 80%? Or should we be more scientific and talking confidence limits like we do when we're sampling? We need to be 99.9% confident that, we're making the correct decisions with the right information here. I think your point about decision nodes is a good one, and that is actually talked to in the original Rev of ICHQ9. The little famous diagram has no decision nodes on it. And they said they're not there because if they put them in, there'd be too many. And I suppose that's true. I mean, Kate, you gave us an excellent example there. I mean, practically every time you score something, you're making a decision. So, I mean, the place would be just littered with decisions. But there is, on the other hand, surely an argument for stage gates. That there's at the end of each stage, there's a robust and almost a contrary risk review, if you know what I mean, where every assumption is challenged and the robustness and the reliability of the information base for decisions is challenged, And I'm not sure we examine that competency of risk review, and I just don't mean in the long term, but actually during the process, whether we, give that, is there a role for competency? and actually, the definition of decision makers is person with competence, So, I don't know, has decision making always been regarded as a bit of a soft skill in our organizations? When we're trained in decision making, I think a lot of the training is gearing us to be better managers, perhaps, rather than better scientific decision makers. This was something, Nuala, do you remember the last day Tim Sandler brought up when you asked him about critical thinking? And I was really inspired by what he said. He was questioning whether we all need to go back to, 101 in terms of scientific approach and method. What's an assumption in scientific terms? How does that affect any conclusion or decision you would make? Is it the same as a hypothesis? Do we know the difference? That really kind of triggered a lot of energy in my head since we spoke to him. And, it's actually something that's been really cool about going back to research, even in my mature years, that reminder that scientific rigor and being the detached observer of the information, the critical eye, as you call it, Nuala, it's really important. But, it's not easy in the pressure of the real world when that lorry is at the door, or truck, as maybe we might call it for our American listeners, it's really hard to have the luxury and leisure, perhaps sometimes, of taking that evidence-based approach. But maybe that's a cultural thing, Nuala.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And certainly a lot of the work I do around culture ends up in this bucket of looking at how we apply the level of scientific rigor to our decisions. And perhaps, we should be referring to it more as that critical thinking, that's what we're trying to bring to it. It's not asking that management question of have we got an answer yet? Are we there yet? It's actually, did we get the right answer? And what was the premise upon which we made that? And for me, those decision makers is not about give me the information that you have and give me your recommendation and I'll decide to agree or disagree with you. For me, those decision makers should be questioning the, those who are making that recommendation, the team of, how did you come to this conclusion? What data did you use? How confident are you about the data that you used? Who did you speak to? What inputs did you seek? They're the kind of questions that I'd like to see decision makers asking before they sit down and say, okay, we're going to go X way or Y way, rather than give me the output of your review, give me your 3 recommendations, and I'll pick one of them. Kate, does any of that trigger anything for you to add?
It does, because I think when we actually prepare for a quality risk assessment in our quality risk management, when we prepare for it properly, it takes away a lot of this ambiguity. So one thing that always amazes me is that everything we do from a qualification point of view in a facility to make a product, everything is with the view of making that product to the quality that it needs to meet. So we don't always take account of that in our quality risk assessments. So we have all our validation data, and if we have to connect things and to be holistic. So if we're saying our qualification is complete and we have all of the controls that we need to have for a certain step, we need to take that qualification and trust it. So we already have some of those decisions made without it being subjective. If we've signed off on the validation that our fill line is working as intended or our isolator provides grade A, then there is no ambiguity. The other thing about assumptions, which is really interesting to hear, is one of the ways that we would always start a risk assessment is putting in the scope and the risk question, but also talking to assumptions. And we've talked about a little bit in the process flow. So if you know what your process is, you don't have any ambiguity because you check your risk that you're assessing against each process step. But then also what you do is you put down an assumption which keeps everybody within a certain boundary so that when they read a risk assessment or a risk-based decision or risk-based rationale, there is no subjectivity in terms of where does the data come from. It should be evident on the page and described and written in a way that anybody can follow, because otherwise a regulator is not going to be able to follow it without lots of explanation. So we need to go back to a little bit of simplicity here and make sure that things are just written in a way that's correct. So just to give you a small example of assumptions, people I've seen in so many risk assessments, what if somebody doesn't follow a procedure? That doesn't belong in a risk assessment. that is about, performance. We have to assume that when our equipment is validated, that it's validated. When people have a procedure to follow, that they will follow it. And when that doesn't happen, we deal with that in our other systems. We don't clog up our risk assessments with that. So we have a very regulated process in all of our industry to make certain products of a quality level. We've already validated everything. We've already shown robustness through PPQs and PV batches. We've done all the development work. We've all the data from that. But still, when I say to somebody, if a process has gone wrong, did you go back to your system risk assessment from when you validated it? Did you look at that risk assessment and did you see that this was going to happen? And what did you say would control it? Nobody's looked at that risk assessment. They've just used, like you said, that experience of right now, and they haven't gone back to that risk assessment that was done 5 years ago that actually contains all the answers to their questions. Yeah. So when we talk about subjectivity and decision makers, sometimes actually the information is there. We've already answered the questions. We just need to guide people in the right direction so that they don't have to be in any way subjective, and it doesn't come down to one person making a decision.
Yeah, and you know what, Kate, this comes back to the living risk assessment of it being we talk regularly on the show about risk management is actually a business capability. If you're doing good risk management, it enables you to run much more effective business. And very often what the risk assessments are viewed as are a compliance checkbox as part of the qualification process. And then they're sent to SharePoint to die, and they never emerge in the light of day again. But listen, coming back to another thing that gets mentioned now, it was obviously a statement in the original guide, but we come back now to this concept of formality and the use of informal methods. And is there enough this time round to confirm for the industry, in terms of how they might understand this spectrum of formality that's inferred here in the draft guide?
Yeah. No, I think we're going to run into trouble. We're going to need some help here as well. On the upside, one of the main clarifications is that formality is not a binary concept. It's not formal and informal. And I think that was well flagged. And it was actually particularly well flagged in a paper in JVT in 2020. You probably remember that, Stacey, written by Dr. O'Donnell and a bunch of practitioners from MSD and Jazz. Ghada Haddad was one of them. You've had her on here before. And, they talked about that idea of the continuum of formality. It's a really good support read for this concept. So we should put that in the goodie bag at the end for sure. But I think the next bother is that the level of formality is expected to be commensurate with some level of importance and uncertainty and complexity in relation to the decision question under consideration. And just even take the simplest of those, importance. Well, now I think we're all going to be talking about when is something important or not important. I feel we're in a looped conversation here somewhat, and at some point, the industry is going to have to scale it, I think. We're going to have to arrive at some consensus. I think there is a pointer that anything that affects a CQA is important. But, does that mean even a small change to a CQA is important? Even a small change in a production and process control trend graph, if it's related to a CPP, is important? Is any deviation, if it happens at a critical control point, important? I just see a lot of, conversations continuing around where people will land, and people may be landing in different places until that reaches a balance. I guess it's a bit ambiguous. And that was a word you used a minute ago, Kate, and I think that's a really good word because, we've an attempt here to address formality, uncertainty, complexity, but ambiguity is a big challenge in risk assessments as well. And that word is kind of left out here a small bit.
Yeah, Kate, based on your own experience, how fluent do you think that the industry is with applying various levels of formality?
I think the industry is probably misunderstood this concept of formality. And again, I go back to, the focus being on the tools and the way that you document it rather than being on the thought process. We as people, we're really adept at risk management. Everybody is, or you wouldn't be here because we wouldn't have survived, if we weren't able to assess risk. So it's really about putting the level of formality in context of what you're trying to do. So for me, I find it very fluent. I'll be honest. I don't find this a difficult part of quality risk management because you just don't do a quality risk assessment if you've got black and white guidance. If you know what the thing is that's gone wrong, you know how you could potentially control it and minimize the impact to the patient, then you've got more of a risk-based rationale, and it's something informal. It might be an impact assessment written in a deviation. From a QP point of view, that's what you'd be using. If, though, you have a process and you're trying to establish what are all the risks in that process, you do need something more formal. You need something that is a process in itself. So you need a way of getting your process flow down on the page. You need a formal scoring tool. You need to identify how you're going to score or prioritize the risks. So you do need that more formal tool just to help guide your thought process. And I really think we shouldn't be putting rules in of where's formal, where's not. Anything in quality risk management ultimately has to link to the patient and protection of the patient, which means that most things are important, but whether or not they're a priority is based on the level of control we have. It's based on the decision that we're trying to make or the categorizations we're trying to make. So the level of formality is whatever level is going to allow you to go through in detail the things that you need to assess and put some sort of shape and structure on them in a way that matches the decision making and the thought process throughout the quality risk management process. If it's a 3-box, template that'll work for that and make it clear, that's great. If you need a 10 or 12-box FMEA because that makes sense, that's good too. Complexity and formality also relates to how many people do you need in the room. Is this something you can do just yourself and get somebody to review? Or do you need to have 10 different departments in order to get that objective view of what's going on? That's to me what formality is. And it's when you again sit down and plan and see what information do you have, what are you trying to achieve, the level of formality automatically becomes evident. So you can't do a full process, on a small document. You need a full process for that. That's formality. So it's really about what you're trying to achieve, and it should be a natural thing to pick the right level of formality based on that.
Yeah. But like you say, trying to get the industry to move away from there, we have 2 tools and we have to use one of them. And one of them is FMEA. But we'll see where we go with that.
And moving on from, we encourage people to move away from that linear way of thinking and to rely on the thought process rather than what's on the page. I think that's the real learning for the industry.
Yeah, moving back a little bit to where we came in on the decision-making piece. How do you think this new description of risk-based decision-making will impact QRM and how it's applied in the QRM strategies? Do you think this concept and the definition that they put in there will make any difference?
I'm not sure if this is going to be a popular view, but I don't really, as somebody who uses this and everything, and I wrote a thesis on this back in 2006, so I suppose I've been around this a long time. I don't disassociate risk-based decision making with the QRM strategy or program. And Valerie made reference to it earlier. Really all of these tools and these processes are just a way of facilitating risk-based decision making. It's the risk-based decision is, do I release that batch that has an issue? Do I release something that has a deviation on it? That's a risk-based decision. The risk-based decision is, how do I prioritize my risks? Where do I apply the CapEx? Do I fix one risk over another risk, and why? It's also looking at things like if you've got fill finish interventions or cleaning frequency, all of these things in day-to-day in a facility. It's what do I do more frequently than something else? That they're all risk-based decisions, and actually that's what we've been trying to do all along. And it's a little bit disappointing to me that we have to give it a whole different section, because I think that's really fundamentally what we're trying to do, is make decisions in our businesses and in our industries to reduce the risk to the patient. And there's decisions all the way along in that, and it's not a separate thing for me.
Yeah, yeah. Val, what about yourself? I know this is your pet peeve.
Well, you see, now we're in danger of turning the episode into a series all in one go. So I suppose we won't dwell on it really. There is a whole page on risk-based decision making. So, it is there, and we have a definition. I think the most important thing about that definition is that it's combining knowledge. I think that is really important. And I think there's another important line in there where it's stating that, it expects a timeline and deliverables to be placed on, the risk management process and an appropriate level of decision making. So I think that's important too, that they recognize that, the decision makers need to be at the right level to make the decisions. I think there's a lot of delegation of decision making happens. And sometimes the real overarching decision maker, has a very reductive view of what occurred in the detail that Kate has been talking about, when she explains the level of preparation and effort that goes into these risk assessments, So look, there's a lot more to talk about. And there is, to come back to that proactive, there's the new concept of rule-based decision making. We need a new acronym, don't we? Because it's the same as, and maybe we also need a little bit of a definition there also. So look, it's a start. I think we need more time really to tease it out, Nuala, but it's a start.
Yeah. Well, we'll see where it goes to. I know from Kate's perspective and your own background as a QP. I mean, that's largely one of the roles of the QP is to take that role as a risk-based decision in everything that you do. But listen, we could, as Val says, we could be here on a whole series all on its own. What's missing, or what do you think will be the main challenges in getting the industry to adopt this new revision once it arrives? Of course, we're in the commenting phase at the moment. Lots of different bodies are putting comments back in, so we don't know where it's going to land. But what do you think is missing out of this revision, Kate?
Well, I think overall it's quite a good guidance, to be honest. I think I'm not sure regulatory guidance is the best place for more detail. I think industry might have to take a little bit more on themselves for deciding what works best. Regulatory guidance are a bit of a double-edged sword. They enable us to move forward, but they do constrain us as well, as we've illustrated in our conversations about tools and scopes and risk decision making. And I think we're still quite focused on being compliant with these things, instead of really embracing the spirit of it and the mindset of it, which is to take a risk-based approach and be able to scientifically and evidentially and confidently back ourselves and explain what we're doing. So, I'm not too depressed about the document overall, and I think some of the gaps or spaces left, I'd be quite happy for industry to fill in with guidance.
Yeah, good. Sorry, Kate, over to you.
I agree with Val in that I think a lot of it is actually how the industry adopt this is the important thing. I think we saw that in the first draft of ICHQ9. Industry made it far too complex and focused maybe on the wrong aspects. And as I said, even in terms of the planning piece and letting tools come out of, defining the risk question or the risk problem, like that was missed by industry the first time around, and that was in the guidance. So it's really about people following it properly. There are a few small things though missing for me in it, and there is a little bit of ambiguity has come into the guidance. Like they talk about severity and being able to use risk control to reduce severity, but if you are a pure risk assessment practitioner, that's not possible in an FMEA sense. You can't reduce severity because it's just the impact. You can reduce the likelihood it'll happen, and you can reduce, you can protect the patient from it, but you actually can't reduce the impact. So I think there is some ambiguity that is still in there that will throw people off. I don't think they've really explained the piece about supply either, because I take the point about risk assessing your supply chains for things like buffers, etc. But ultimately, the patient doesn't care about whether or not we can get buffers to make the product. They only care that they get the product and the product is going to not make them more ill. So that's a business perspective. And I think they haven't separated out that piece of, you know, whatever happens in terms of your yield or your operability or, you know, anything like that, that's all business, and have a process for that to reduce that risk. But if we're talking about quality risk management, we're only concerned with the patient and the patient experience. And that could have been emphasized a little bit more, because certainly that's something I have to re-explain to people over and over again. You know, I'm not worried that your yield is low as long as the patient can get what they need. So I think that really needs to be explained probably a little bit more clearly. But apart from that, again, as I said at the start, I don't think the basic fundamentals have changed. I think the wording is there if you want to go and look for it, that actually sends you on the right path. But I think as an industry, and I totally agree with Val, I think we actually need to listen to what the guidance is telling us, understand that it's connected to OpEx, it's connected to knowledge management. And I suppose one of the things I would love to see written in there, and it's something I say to a lot of people, is if you do a really good risk assessment, let's say on a process, you should be able to hand that to an operator on the floor. They should be able to understand what the process flow is from start to finish. They should understand what all the controls are to prevent risk and why certain procedures are there. And I think if we used risk assessment in that way, it would be much better for the industry, and people would actually understand why they have to do the things that they do within, you know, manufacturing or their facilities. So sometimes it's an opportunity lost. So I'd love to see that granularity, even in one paragraph, just to explain this will make your life easier. It's not just to tick the box.
Totally agree. I couldn't emphasize that point more. So listen, I think we need to wrap for today before Stacey gives up on us all together and we take over the whole the whole podcast series. Stacey, what are your thoughts?
So interesting. I think there's much more discussion to be had. Hopefully we'll talk about that again in another episode. IVT is also planning for October timeframe to do an issue of the Journal of GXP Compliance dedicated to ICH Q9 and people's thoughts on it. So I think it's a great time to pause here. But Nuala, remind us what you have for our listeners as some of our key takeaways from the Risk Revolution team this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll kick off with Kate's blog, which started us off on this pathway for today's episode. We'll, of course, link to the revision. I'm sure many people have already accessed it, but just in case, there's also a link to an ICH presentation that can be useful as a training device. Just it goes through what the changes are between the previous, the existing guidance and the new draft. And I think it's worth taking a run through that. And of course, we will jump into Dr. O'Donnell's 2020 IVT paper on formality, and even Val's recent one on risk-based decision-making. And of course, we should link back to both our podcasts with Tim Sandel and Marty Lippa. I think they might be useful as well. Lots of goodies.
Yeah, so many goodies, as usual. Thank you so much to our risk revolutionaries, Nuala, Val, and Kate. And I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, for his continued work on this series. Lastly, thanks to you, our valued listeners. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this episode, we remind you to share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review in your podcast player of choice so that other people can find us too. For today's show notes and Nuala's takeaways from this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, make it a great week.